let's talk about measuring the economy. Okay? Remember we said that the government has to control inflation and make sure that we don't have large amounts of unemployment. To understand that, they have to go out and collect data. Okay? So not only do they collect data on employment statistics, by the way, we talked about discouraged workers, right? People who have given up working, looking for a job because they don't believe there's a job out there, and they drop out of the labor force, so they're no longer included in the unemployment statistics. Okay? How does the government know that they quit looking for a job? You know how they know? No, they actually call you on the phone. They will call households on the phone and they will interview them, or they will show up, actually, as in, like in the census, and they will ask you how many people, how many adults in the household, how many are working, how many are unemployed looking for work, and how many are unemployed and not looking for work. Okay, and they'll extrapolate that data. They'll only look at like 100,000 households, and then they'll expand that data to make it relevant to the whole country. Okay. So the figures, probably not that accurate that often. Not too far off, okay? All right. Now, let's say that Julio and I are the only two people in our economy, okay? And Julio produces a beautiful leather jacket, all right? And I buy that leather jacket for $500. It's really nice. It's an Armani. All right? And that's the only economic activity that occurs in our economy. What is our GDP? $500 million, $500, right? Okay. How do you know that our GDP is $500? Because you sold something that you produced for $500, right? Is there another way to figure out that the size of our GDP is 500? Yes, it's how much I spent also, okay? Because in every economic exchange, what the seller earns has to be exactly equal to what the buyer spends, right? So if I spend 500 on Julio, he earns 500. Our GDP can be measured by either finding out how much did he earn for producing these goods and services, or how much did we spend on him, because it's got to be the same, okay? And if it's just Julio and I, it's pretty easy. But let's say you all produce something, and I go around and I buy all of these things from you, and I spend 500 on you, and 200 on you, and 50 on you, and 1,000 on you, and 200 on you, and 20 on you, okay? If I go around and I total up everything that I spent, and you total up everything that you all earned or got for producing that, it would have to be exactly the same, right? So we have two ways of measuring the size of the economy. How much did we spend on these goods and services that were produced, or how much did we earn for producing them, okay? Now, there's a couple of problems here, all right? Do we necessarily sell everything that we produce? No, okay? So as we're going to see, we're going to have a way of capturing what we produce within, remember, GDP is the total value of the final goods and services produced within the borders of the nation over the course of a year, okay? Whether or not anybody buys them. So we have to have a way of capturing what we produce but do not sell, all right? Now, the other thing, well, we'll get to that. So we can construct what's called a simple circular flow of the economy, all right? Where on one side of our map here, we're going to have business firms, suppliers, producers, manufacturers. Okay, we're going to put a BF for business firms. And over here, we're going to have what we call households. Okay, households are individuals and families. All right. Now, all of the factors of production are owned by individuals, either by themselves or in concert in collection with others. Right. If you're a part owner of a corporation, then you own resources, right? I shouldn't say it that way. You own a taxi, right? You provide taxi service, that's a resource that you own, okay? We provide all of our labor, entrepreneurial activity. We supply, as either individuals or together, raw materials. And who buys that stuff? Business firms, okay? So we supply all of the factors of production to companies, okay, factors, for companies to produce goods and services. And in return, what do we get? Money. Money. They pay us to work, okay, and supply capital or whatever, all right? And with our factors, with our resources, okay, goods are produced that we consume. And in order to acquire those goods, we have to pay money, okay? So we have what's called a simple circular flow. And the simple circular flow is based on two principles, okay? In every economic exchange, what the buyer spends has to be exactly equal to what the seller earns. Cannot be different. If I spend $1,000 on goods and services that you all produce, you earn 1,000. Not 1,005 or less than that, exactly that, okay? What is spending by one group is income to another in equal amounts, okay? All right? The other principle is that goods and services flow in this direction while money payments flow in the opposite, okay? All right? We supply the resources that business needs to produce goods and services that we buy. They pay us money, and we use that money to acquire goods and services. Okay so far? Okay. If we're going to assume for the moment that everything that business takes in, they pay out again to somebody, then the total income that business earns has to be, the total money that business earns has to be equal to our total income. The total value of what we produce, we all produced $1,000 worth of goods and services, and I bought it. The total value of what we produce has to be equal to the total value of what we were paid for producing it, okay? If we assume that business takes in $1,000, say, okay, for goods and services that they produce, and remember, for the time being in our simple circular flow, we're going to assume that business sells everything that they produce that year. They sell it, okay? We'll talk about why that's, how we deal with that, all right? And that all the money that they come, business can retain some earnings, right? They don't necessarily spend all the money, okay? But we're going to assume that all the money that comes in goes out again to somebody, okay? Who gets paid for working or for supplying resources? Workers, right? So wages have to be paid. Wages. We'll say 500. Okay? Plus, if we don't own the building in which we are producing, or we don't own the machines, if the business doesn't own those, they have to pay rent. Okay? So they have to pay rent. We'll say 200. In addition, let's say they borrowed money from the bank. That money has to be paid back to the bank. That's a wash. You borrow 1,000, you pay 1,000 back. Over and above that, you have to pay interest, okay? So the bank earns interest money. In addition to paying for what we've already borrowed, it comes in, go out, okay? We have to pay interest. We'll say $100, okay? Wages, rents, and interest comes up to $800. Business takes in 1,000. 800 gets paid out to workers, to the owners of the capital, and to the lenders of money. Okay? What happens to the other $200? Profit. Exactly right. Profit. The owner has to be paid also, right? If there's no profit, what happens? No business. Exactly, okay? So just like wages, rent, and interest, profit is a business expense. The owner has to be paid also. So all of the money comes in, flows out again to somebody else, okay? Now, we are assuming that with this money, right, that we spend it all. Do we always spend all of our income? No, we save some of it, okay? So let's say that we save $100 savings. What happens to the amount of money we earned 1,000, okay? But we save 100, now we've only got 900 to spend. We spend 900, Business takes in only 900. They pay us 900 and we save another 100. Now we've got only 800 to spend. And what's going to happen? Our simple circular flow is going to shrink and shrink and shrink. Okay? So how do we deal with this? Well, what happens to our money when we save it and it goes into the bank? Does that money just sit there in the bank? That's right. It gets lent out to somebody else. Okay? It gets lent to somebody else. Under classical economic theory, okay, we're going to diverge from classical. Okay? The market for borrowed money is just like any other market. Okay? What is the price of money? What do you have to pay to borrow money? Interest. Okay? When interest rates are really high, business has demand to borrow money. We are the suppliers of savings. Okay? When interest rates are really high, business doesn't want to borrow much money, but we want to save a lot. And what do we get? We get a surplus. And banks will find out that they can't lend out all of the money that they're taking in savings. So what are they going to do? They will lower the interest rate. Okay? And at some interest rate, the quantity of money we are saving will be equal to the quantity of money business is borrowing. So in this classical economic model, any money that we save will be borrowed and spent by business instead. Okay, so that money will go back into the circular flow. All right with that? Okay. Okay? Now, I have to tell you that Keynes says this is nonsense. Okay? Okay? Here's why. All right? If you are making, well, let's move on to another one. How much do you think it costs to live in Boston for the year? How much money do you have to be earning to live in Boston, do you think? You know, reasonable. How much? How much? 40,000? Okay, we'll just say 40,000, all right? You think it's higher than that? Depends on where you live. Yeah, of course. Right, okay. Beacon Hill? Yeah, really, maybe. Okay? So let's say that you're earning $40,000 a year. Okay? And then we have, we'll say, how much is Tim Tebow going to make? Do we know? We'll say, how much does Brady make a year? 10, 15 million a year? Something? We'll just say 10 million, just for the hell of it. Okay? All right. Now, if interest rates, this is you. Okay? If interest rates are 18% per year, okay, and you're earning $40,000 a year, remember, what this theory says is that when, just like other things, when prices are low, we don't supply much money. When interest rates are low, we don't save much. When interest rates are high, we save more, right? That's what this thing has to be for this to be accurate, that when interest rates are high, we are the suppliers, we save a lot. When they're low, we save less. Okay? All right. Now, if you're making $40,000 a year and interest rates are 18%, how much are you going to save? That's the question. Will you have some? What did we just say? This is what it costs you to live in the city. Are you going to have any extra money to save? No. Does it matter if interest rates are 18%? No. What if interest rates are 1.8%? Is Mr. Brady going to save any money?
Sure.
Hell yeah. Okay. Does it matter what interest rates are to Mr. Brady, how much he's going to save? No. Okay? So this is Keynes's point, that interest rates really don't have a lot to do with how much we save. What determines how much we save? How much we earn. If we're not making enough to make ends meet, we don't save anything, no matter what interest rates are. If we're making tons and tons of money, no matter what interest rates are, we'll save some. Okay, Julio?
But you may say to invest that money instead of saving.
That's a form of savings. Okay, investment is a form of saving. Okay, so that's true. By the way, when we talk about investment in this class, In economics, we don't mean investment in the term that, in the way that we normally think about it, that you invest in stocks and bonds and things like that, financial investments, okay? When we talk about, we don't care about that. That's just ownership, all right? Financial transactions, we don't include at all in GDP. So when we talk about investment, what we're talking about is investment in like fixed capital, machinery, buildings, and the like, all right? And physical things, not in financial instruments at all. Okay? All right. So we have our simple circular flow so far. We've got business firms on one side, households on the other. We supply the factors, resources. We get paid for that. And with our resources, business produces goods, services, and with the money we earn from working, we buy that, okay? So we have, so far, this is income, right? Wages, rents. Why is this doing this? Wages, rents, interest, net interest, okay? We subtract interest, what we pay out from interest that we earn, and profits. Now there are two other pieces, okay? Remember, in our simple circular flow, everything that comes in goes out again. When you go over here to CVS and you buy, because you forgot your sunglasses, you buy a $15 pair of sunglasses to wear for the day, right? When you get to the counter, it says $15. When you get to the counter, do you pay $15, just 15? No, you got to pay tax, right? Now, is that income to any of these people? No. That money goes to the government, right? Business collects that and passes it on to the government. The money comes in, so we have to account for it going out. Those are called indirect business taxes because they're not a tax on business, they're a tax on us. They just are collected by business, okay? Import taxes fall into the same category. All right? There are some others. So indirect business taxes. The best way to think of these is sales tax, okay? Strictly just a sales tax. Business takes in the tax money and then gives it to the IRS, okay? The IRS. We talked about that? Do you know why it's the IRS? Okay. There's. The IRS. All right, so that's another thing. Now, there's another piece in here that we're going to add in, all right, and it's called depreciation. Why is this doing this? It's doing way below where I'm writing it. I think this thing needs to be calibrated again. Okay, depreciation, D-E-P-R-E-C-I-A-T-I-O-N. Okay, depreciation. Oh, well, I just extended the page. Okay, how do I get rid of that? I don't know. Oh, no, will that do it? I know I did, but I want to learn about flicks. All right, doesn't matter. Okay, we'll move on to another one. All right, so depreciation. Now, the official definition of depreciation is the loss in value of an asset, a machine, or a building through use, wear and tear, okay? When you buy a brand new machine and you use it for a year, at the end of the year, it's got some wear and tear on it. Some of the belts or some of the circuit boards might need replacing, some of the wheels, whatever, okay? So it loses value. If we assume that somebody repairs that machine, brings it back up to like new value, okay, that wouldn't, it might fit into here, into wages, okay? Somebody earned that money for doing it, but we're going to keep it a separate item for a couple of reasons that we're going to see separately, shortly, okay? So we're going to include depreciation. Okay, as a separate line item, all right? Think of it as, in this case, repair work, all right? Repair work done to bring machines back up to brand new like condition, all right? Okay, So this is what we earn for producing goods and services. This is called the income approach to determining GDP, okay? And so all of the money that comes in, the income approach, is equal to wages plus interest plus rents plus profits plus indirect business taxes plus depreciation. Okay? Wages, interest, rents, profits, indirect business taxes, and depreciation. WRPID. Okay? All right, can you see that okay? Okay? Now, will I extend the page again? Yeah, keeps doing it. I don't know how to go backwards, so we'll just get a new page. All right? Okay. We'll put this back up. Okay? So we have this piece now, but we know that this has to be equal to this. That whatever the business takes in, it pays out again in equal amounts. What is income to business is expense to us in equal amounts, and what is income to us here is expense to business in equal amounts, right? Okay? So our total spending on goods and services has to be equal to our total income. If we spend $1 million on goods and services, we earn $1 million. Can't be any different, right? Okay? Who spends money on goods and services? Who buys stuff? We do, right? We engage in consumption spending, okay? So we have C will stand for consumption spending. In fact, 2 out of every $3 spent on goods and services are spent by consumers. Okay? Who else buys goods and services? Government does, absolutely. Okay? This is a government business, correct? Yeah. When we talk about government, we mean the federal government, state government, local governments. And this is a government business. They are buying my services, right? Okay. Who else buys goods and services? Business does. Okay? Business. All right? We're going to call that, it's actually called gross private domestic investment. Okay? Additions to the economy that we did not have last year in terms of productive capacity, okay? And investments in materials that aren't sold. This is what we'll deal with each one of these pieces. Gross private domestic investment has 3 pieces. Okay? First off, investments in fixed capital. Okay? Machinery and buildings. Okay? That's what business buys. Now, I don't know the answer to this. I'm not an economist. When we buy a new rug for our house, okay, that appears here in consumption spending, right? What about if business buys a new rug for the office? Where does that appear? I don't know. Huh?
That's kind of expensive.
Is it fixed capital?
No, it's not.
Maybe.
It's operation.
What if they buy a painting for the wall? Right? What does that show up in terms of spending?
If the painting lasts forever or temporary, I need to repaint again.
Maybe, but you still have to capture the spending. Doesn't matter. Okay? I'm not sure. Don't know where it shows up. Okay? As far as there's only 3 pieces to gross private business investment. Okay? And that first one is fixed capital. We don't buy machinery and buildings, right, to produce goods and services. We'd be a business. So fixed capital, machines and buildings. 2. Housing. Okay? Huh? When we build a house, that's included as gross private domestic investment. Okay? The reason being is that that house can be used as a resource to generate income if you rent it out to somebody. Okay? Okay. So we include domestic business, domestic housing construction. as part of our gross private domestic investment, okay? And then lastly, remember in our simple circular flow, we assume that everything business produced, they sold, but they don't, okay? If Raytheon produces some electronic equipment in December, it's most likely that good isn't going to be sold till sometime February, March, April, right? But we need to capture the value of that in the year in which it's produced. So what we have to do is figure out what did we start with the year in terms of materials, okay? Goods, and inventory can be materials or finished goods, things that are produced and sitting on the shelf, or I can't remember what the other one is, but we have to figure out what did we start with the year and what did we end with. In other words, if I begin the year with $1,000 worth of finished goods sitting on the shelf, should I include that $1,000 in my GDP for, let's say this is at the beginning, this is January, okay, of 2013, January 1. I have $1,000 worth of goods sitting on the shelf that I produced last year. We don't want to include that in this year's inventory. But if I add $1,000 to that inventory this year, so that I now have $2,000 worth of goods on the shelf at the end of the year, what portion of this do I want to include in my current year's GDP? Only the 1,000 that we produced this year, okay? So what we are really interested in is changes in inventory. It's going to drive me crazy. If we started the year with $1,000 worth of inventory and we end the year with 0, okay? All right? Yeah, we have to subtract that $1,000 because that was due last year, okay? So the change in inventory is ending inventory, okay, minus beginning inventory. So if I end the year with 2,000 and I begin the year with 1,000, I've added 1,000 this year, that's all, okay? I've added 1,000 this year, all right? If I begin the year with 2,000, okay, and I end up the year with 1,000, then I got to take 1,000 out because I don't want to include that in terms of what I produced. That was last year's production, okay? So to get changes in inventory, we find out what did we end the year up with and subtract from that what we began the year with, okay? And that can be positive or negative, okay? All right? And then finally, we also produce goods and services in this country, Gesundheit, that we don't buy, government doesn't buy, and business doesn't buy. Who are they bought by? Foreigners, people outside of the country, okay? We export lots of stuff. What nation is do we talk about this already? What nation's the largest exporting nation on the planet? China is, and that's only recent. That's the last 2 years, okay? Only recently has China become number one, the last 2 years. Who was number one before that? The United States, okay? Or Germany, believe it or not, yeah, all right? Neck and neck. Usually the United States, but sometimes Germany, okay? What nation is the largest importing nation on the planet? The U.S. by far. Nobody else even comes close, okay? So that makes us, if we're number 3 or 2 or 3 in terms of exports and number 1 in terms of imports by far, that makes us easily the largest trading nation on the planet, okay? More goods and services cross our border than any other country's borders, all right? Both import and export. By the way, what is the largest trade border with the United States? What country do we do the most business with in terms of exports and imports? Do you know? You think China? No, it's Canada. Exactly right, Canada. And number 2, not China either, Mexico. That's right, Mexico lindo. Beautiful Mexico. All right, so the United States, we have to account for what we produce here, but we don't buy here, bought by other people outside of the country. So we have to add in exports. However, A lot of the money that we spend on goods and services, and business spends on goods and services, and government buys, are not produced. Those goods are not produced here in this country, right? When you buy a Toyota, do we want to include that amount of money in our GDP? No. Most of that, some of it, but most of it goes to Japan's GDP, okay? So we want to subtract imports. Okay? I'm sorry, Young?
iPad, you know, Apple's product
Apple, yeah.
made in China, right?
Made in China, almost certainly.
So that's exported from China or exported to China or
Imported from China, yeah.
But actually, it's just some parts.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, I mean, we export a bunch of parts and maybe machinery to produce these goods, and they produce them in China and then ship the finished goods back, right? But we have a huge trade imbalance with China.
So this is some confusing part, you know.
It's confusing?
Yeah.
Why?
Each part of iPad is made in from somewhere else.
Somewhere else.
And they're sent to China
Yes.
to let Chinese
Yes, true.
to put it together. Then it comes on the import from China.
Yes, that's right.
The
That's a
math
very
is
good point. Yes.
But design from here. Just send
Maybe design, maybe parts,
Yes.
whatever, okay?
So-
Yeah, but because it came from China to here, even though most of it may be US parts or Japanese parts or wherever, right? It's
Yes.
included as an import from China. That's a good point, very good point.
The number is
Yeah.
kind of suspicious.
Yes, it is. That's quite true. Japan, by the way, had a huge, before China did, Japan had a huge trade balance with the United States, right? That they were exporting way more to us than we were exporting to them. And we start to get a little irritated about that type of thing because it's very hard to penetrate the Japanese market, okay? So what did the Japanese do to try to reduce this trade balance? They started manufacturing some of it in here, some of it in Taiwan, some in Korea, some in Singapore, so that looked like these goods were now coming from those countries instead of Japan. Okay? At any rate, what does this number look like for the United States, net exports? Do you know? Yeah, it's a huge negative number, okay? I believe, I don't remember what it was last year. I should know these things, but I kind of, once I quit teaching, I don't pay so much attention. But I think the year before last, or the year before that, it was a negative $781 billion, okay? That we imported almost $1 trillion worth of goods and services more than we exported, okay? We are definitely the largest importing nation on the planet by far. Nobody even comes close. The number 2 is way down the road, okay? We are so critical to the rest of the world's economy. If we stop buying, they go into a recession. If we go into a recession, they go into a depression, okay? In fact, they used to say that if the United States catches a cold, the rest of the world gets the flu. Okay? Because they are so dependent upon us buying goods and services from them. Yes, Julio?
But from a point of economics, is it good that you import so much than what you produce?
Well, let me ask you. If you constantly wrote checks to somebody else for more than you're putting in your account, what's going to happen to you? You're going to go bankrupt. Exactly right. Okay? Or, you know what we have to do in order to satisfy our debts? We have to sell off assets, sell off things we own to foreigners in order to get the money to pay our bills. Okay? Who do we owe the most money to? China, by far. How much do we owe China? Do you know? Yeah, more than $1 trillion. Why do we owe them so much?
Selling bonds.
Yes, exactly right. When the U.S. government wants to borrow money, if the Chinese don't show up to lend it, we are screwed. Okay? It used to be the Japanese. If the Japanese didn't show up, we were in deep trouble. But now it's the Chinese that are buying up all our debt. What are they going to do with that? What are they going to do if we give them their $1 trillion? What are they going to do with that money? What can you do with $1 trillion? You can invest in the United States or buy American goods. Right? There's lots of issues involved with them having so much of our debt. Okay? We owe them lots and lots of money, but they have a hard time collecting it. Okay? All right. So, exports for the United States are much less than imports, so we have a negative number. What happens if imports rise? What happens to our GDP if we increase our imports? GDP goes down. That's right, because imports are a subtraction from our GDP. So the more we import, the more our GDP goes down. Okay? So we have on what's called the expenditures approach, okay, to GDP approach. We've got consumption plus gross private domestic investment plus government spending plus net exports. Okay? That's the expenditure approach to GDP. It's the sum of what we spend, the three components of gross private domestic investment, fixed capital, housing, and changes in inventory, what government buys, and then what we export minus what we import. Okay? And that has to be equal to our wages, interest, rents, profits, indirect business taxes, and depreciation. The two pieces have to be equal. CIGX equals WIRPID. SIGX equals WARPID. Okay? No forgetter. All right? Okay. Net exports. Net exports, or X. Okay? C plus G plus I plus X. Okay? Did I tell you I wrote a book on exporting? Yeah, last spring I wrote a book on exporting and importing. You can buy it at Amazon.com, $52.50. Export Essentials and the Import Process. That's the name of it. I wrote it for a course I taught here, import-export. Right? I used it one semester, and then I retired. All right, you guys? Yeah. Wages, interest, rents, profits, indirect business taxes, and depreciation. Okay. Now, let's go back to the gross bit. We've got two grosses. We've got gross private domestic investment and gross domestic product. Okay. When I say, what's your gross pay, what am I asking you for? Yeah, what your total annual salary might be. Okay. Well, what's the difference between gross and net? Yeah, something gets deducted, okay? Taxes, whatever, all right? So your net pay is what you take down. Now, if we wanted to find out what did we actually add to the economy that we did not have last year, okay? We don't want to include the value of, where were we? Let's start another one. Gross domestic product, okay? The total value of what we added. Remember, from the expenditures approach, that includes depreciation. Sorry, from the income approach, okay? Wages, interest, rents, profits, indirect business taxes, plus depreciation. If I built a machine in 2011, okay, and I sold that machine for $10,000, and in 2012, okay, it was only worth $9,000 because of wear and tear, and I added $1,000 worth of repairs to it to bring that machine back up to brand new condition, do I have any more machine in 2012 than I had in 2011? If I didn't produce anything in 2012, would I have any real addition to the economy at all? No, okay? So if we want to find out what did we actually add to the economy over and above what we had last year, we don't want to include the value of repair work, okay? So GDP minus the value of depreciation, okay, gives us net domestic product. What do we actually add to the economy? There's another way of thinking about this. if I produce $1,000 worth of, $10,000 worth of goods and services this year, but to do that, I had to use up my machine to the tune of $1,000 of deterioration, or $1,000 worth of materials, or whatever, okay? What I added was that 10,000 minus what it cost me, all right, to produce that in terms of wear and tear on my capital stock, all right? I had to use up $1,000 worth of my machine to produce $10,000 worth of product. So really what I added was only $9,000 once I subtract the $1,000 that it cost me. Okay with that? Okay. And that's true for gross private domestic investment. Okay. If we added $10,000 worth of machinery, gross private domestic investment, it cost us $1,000 worth of machinery to do that, then net private domestic investment is gross private domestic investment minus depreciation. Okay? All right with that? So if we say that GDP was 10,000 last year, okay, and net domestic product turned out to be 8,500, then the difference between the two is depreciation of 1,500. Okay? The difference between gross domestic product, the total value of everything we did last year, minus value of repair work or loss in value of assets, gives us the net addition to the economy. Okay with that? Okay. In this chapter, the only other measures of national income that I care about are personal income. Okay? That's your gross pay. Okay? Your gross pay. But do you get to spend your gross pay? No. You have to pay personal income taxes. And then what you have left over is called personal, or just plain, disposable income. Okay? Yeah, what you can dispose, spend. All right? And actually disposable income has two pieces, discretionary and non-discretionary. Right? Non-discretionary, you don't have a choice. You've got to pay your rent. You've got to pay your taxes. You've got to pay your fuel bill. Not taxes, your fuel bill. All right? Those things that you have to pay for your clothing. And then, well, maybe not even clothing. Everything else is optional. That's the discretionary part, to spend on whatever you want. Right? Okay? Yeah, that you can just, yeah, non-discretionary. You've got to cough that up for your automobile monthly payment, right? Okay. Now, do we talk about what's included in GDP here? No. Okay. Not everything is included in our measurement of GDP, right? There's some things that we don't include. Remember, we want to capture the total value of all final goods and services produced within the borders of the nation over the course of the year. So we don't include what I already talked to you about, things called intermediate goods, right? Intermediate goods. No intermediate goods. Goods that are going to be further processed. Further, like when a company makes headlights for an automobile. We don't going to include those headlights as part of our GDP because nobody's going to use them all by themselves, right? They have to be included in the car. And once they are incorporated into a car and that car is sold for $20,000, that $20,000 includes the value of the headlights, okay? Say what? Then it would be included in GDP, I suppose, right? Because it actually is in its finished form. Yeah, that's true. That's interesting. I wonder how they capture that. I don't know. Okay. All right. So we don't include the value of things that are going to be further processed, incorporated into some other good, that are going to be used in producing some other good. Like we don't count the grain when we make the cereal. We don't count the hops until we make the beer. Okay. All right. So no intermediate goods. Let me step back a little bit. To be included in GDP, two things have to be true. Okay? A brand new good or service has to be produced that year. And the second piece is it has to be visible to the government, meaning that somebody declared income and paid taxes on it. Okay? So if I do a job for my buddy, the carpenter, and at the end of the day he hands me $50 cash, okay, am I going to declare that income? Of course I am. Okay. All right. What do we call that when you get paid like that? It's called under the table, okay, because it's not visible. He doesn't tell anybody, the government, that he's paying me, and I don't tell him either, right? Right, and that's what works out well for both of us, right? Because he doesn't have to take out taxes, so he doesn't have to pay me more, and I don't have to pay taxes, so I can take a little less, right? Okay? You always pay your taxes, right? So, intermediate goods. Okay. What else? Underground activity. Right? Under the table stuff. And this can be legal stuff, right? In the summertime, I mow lawns for a living for my uncle who owns a landscaping business, and he pays me cash. Okay? That's legal to work. It's not legal not to pay. Or illegal, right? I'm a Coke dealer. I earned $1 million last year. Am I going to declare that as income? Hell no. Right? And I told you what the tax code says. You have to declare all income, both legal and illegal. All right? So underground activity. When I buy stocks and bonds, okay? Yeah, should I buy stocks and bonds? Okay? We understand what stock is. Stock is part ownership. When you buy stock, you're part owner of a company. Okay? By the way, the stock market itself, like the New York Stock Exchange, that's the market for used stocks, not new stocks, used stocks. Okay? It's only when stocks are resold by somebody do they appear in the marketplace. When corporations initially sell stock, they sell it to a large investment bank, and that large investment bank in turn sells it to their best customers. It's only when their best customers decide that they want to get rid of that stock does it appear on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, okay? All right, so it's the used stock market, okay? All right, so financial transactions, when I buy stocks or bonds, bond is lending somebody money, government, corporations, okay? When I do that, have I produced a good or service? No, okay? Something has to have been manufactured. So we don't include financial transactions, okay? Buying what are called securities. Financial instruments, securities, stocks, bonds, all the same thing, okay? So financial transactions excluded. And we don't include what are called transfer payments. Why is that doing that? I gotta fix this, all right? Transfer payments, when I lose my job and I collect unemployment, this government sends me money, okay? Do I have to do anything in return for that? No, okay? So transfer payments are payments made to people for which nothing is expected in return. Unemployment, welfare, Social Security, okay? Those are all transfer payments, and the value of those payments is not included in GDP because nothing is actually produced, okay? So no transfer payments. And then lastly, I think it's lastly, remember, we want to capture the value of goods that are produced in the year that they are produced. Okay? So if I bought a car last year and then sell it this year to my neighbor, for what I sell it to my neighbor, that's not included in GDP. That's a used good. Okay? We captured the value of that good in the year it was produced. When I sell my car to my neighbor, I haven't produced any new good or service this year. Okay? So that's not included. Second-hand goods. Used goods, second-hand goods. Now, however, if I take my old car down to the car dealer and I sell it to the car dealer for $4,000 and he puts it on his lot and then eventually he sells it for $6,000, the $2,000 profit that he earns would be included in GDP, okay? Because that's his payment for buying the car, you know, storing it, maintaining it, negotiating with people, and selling it, all right? So any profit on a used good would be included, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that you bought your TV for $1,000 last year and you sell it for $1,200 this year, okay? 2 reasons that won't be included. It is a resale. You may have made $200 on it, but you're not going to declare that, right, as income, okay? So if a used good is used to make a profit, in other words, somebody provides some additional service and makes some additional money, then that portion would be included, okay? So in our measurement of GDP, remember, 2 things have to be true. Has to be a brand new good or service produced that year, and it has to be visible to the government. So we don't include underground activity. It's not visible to the government. And in some countries, by the way, this type of activity may amount to a substantial amount of money. I mean, maybe we should try to capture this underground activity. In fact, some countries do try to capture that, include it as part of their value. I mean, here in the United States, I think it's like 10 to 15% of all economic activity is underground, invisible to the government. Some places like India, it may approach 35 to 40% of all economic activity is underground. Nobody is declaring income and nobody's paying taxes on what they're doing, okay? So it could be a substantial amount of difference between what is our true GDP if we include underground activity and what the official is, okay? So no used goods, no goods that are going to be further processed, no financial transactions, no transfer payments. And that can be either public or private, right? My son in college says, "Dad, can you loan me $100?" And I give him $100, okay? Is that included in our GDP? No, not until he spends it, all right? Not until he spends it on drugs and alcohol. Like all college kids, no. Just kidding. All right, you guys? Okay. Now, I talked about this last time, about the fact that we can't really just say the economy is growing because we went up from 1,000 GDP to 1,200 GDP. Does that mean the economy grew by 20%? No, we don't know that. Some of this increase is due to increased prices. Some of it's due to increased production. But we can't figure that out unless we know by what percentage did prices go up, and then factor that out of the current nominal GDP, okay? Let's say this is 2013, and that's 2012. So without knowing how much prices went, if all prices went up by 20%, we would know that there's no increase in real output, right? That we're just charging more for the same amount of goods. So the first thing we have to do is compute the price index, figure out by how much did prices change from this year to this year. And if we find that by going out and, right, we take the cost of a basket of goods today and divide it by the cost of the basket in the base period, this is going to drive me insane. Okay, and then multiply by 100, that gives us our index. So if everything costs $1,100 in 2013, right, we would have the cost of that basket today, $1,100, divided by the basket in the base period, 1,000, that would be 1.1, and then multiplied by 100 gives us an index of 110. Remember, all this is a percentage. Year 2013 prices are 110% of year 2012 prices. So what we want to do is take every $1.10 here and make it equal to $1. The way we can do that is to divide nominal GDP by our index. And then to get back at a rate, multiply by 100, and that gives us real GDP in constant 2012 dollars. So we make everything here equal to, we make every dollar equal to $1.10 by dividing it by $1.10, but we're going to divide it by 110 and then multiply by 100. Okay, same thing. All right. So what would we get? 1,200 divided by 110. Anybody can do that real quick? Mentally, oh, calculate. 1.99999. 10.9.
Oh, yeah, 10.9.
10.9. Oh, it's supposed to be 1,100. Sorry. So it'd be 1.09. Okay, and we multiply that by. Is that right? Yeah. Multiply that by 100, and we get a real GDP of 1090. So in a real sense, the economy grew by 9%. Okay? It went from 1,000 in a real sense to 1,090. Okay? All right with that? So real GDP is today's nominal GDP reduced by the rate of inflation. Real GDP is nominal GDP adjusted for price changes between years. Okay? Real GDP is nominal GDP that has been adjusted for inflation by reducing it by this is actually the GDP deflator. Okay? All right with that? That the index, the price index that we use is the GDP deflator, not the consumer price index or the producer price index. It's the GDP deflator. All right with that so far? Okay. Now, we'll go over that again, don't worry. At least once more. Okay. All right. Now, what country has the largest GDP in the world? U.S. Okay. I don't know. I haven't got latest figures, but I'm going to use 2011 figures. U.S. GDP. Oops, wrong. Made a mistake already. Hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, trillions. $15 trillion. Okay? Who's number 2? Any idea? It's not China. Oh, I take that. Is it China? Yeah, I think it is China now. China is number 2 now. Yes, they overtook Japan, I think, last year or the year before. And in 2011, half the size of the United States. Okay? All right? All right. So, and number 3 is Japan, I believe, and then Germany. I'm not sure. Can't remember, but most of the countries in the top 20 are Europeans, with the exception of, who was in there? Turkey's European, okay? I think they were number 17 or 18. Indonesia is in the top 20. The other one that I was surprised at, Saudi Arabia, is ranked number 20 in terms of gross domestic product. What do they produce? Oil. That's pretty much it. Right? Okay. Now, let's say that, let's compare the United States and Japan, right? Let's go back a little bit earlier. Which country do you think has a larger GDP, India or Monaco? Are you familiar with Monaco? No, it's on the Riviera. It's great, you know, the Grace Kelly, Princess Grace, and Prince Rainier. Okay, yeah. Yes, exactly. It's where James Bond goes to gamble, right? Huh? Okay. Which country do you think has a larger GDP, India or Monaco? No, hell no. India's way, 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 way bigger. Okay, India's ranked about 11th or 12th in the world in terms of total GDP. Okay, whose citizens do you think are better off on average, Indians or Monacans? Absolutely, by far and away. Why? Because they have even though it's a smaller GDP, it has to be divided amongst far fewer people. Okay, so when we want to compare how we are doing against other countries, like maybe China's GDP will be equal to that of the United States in 5 or 6 years. Does that mean that the average citizen is going to have the same standard of living as the average American? No, because there are 4 times as many people in China as in the United States. Okay. In fact, they've estimated truly, that for the Chinese person, the average Chinese person, to achieve the same standard of living that we enjoy here in this country, we would need 2 more Earths, and resource-wise, okay? So it's unlikely that the average income of Chinese people will ever approach that of the United States, at least not in our lifetime, ever, okay? The thing about China is that there are huge differences between parts of China in terms of wealth. No middle class. There's really wealthy or not poor, right? Pretty much. People who live in the urban areas and nearby are, for the most part, relatively speaking, wealthy, and then people who are out in the countryside are, relatively speaking, very poor, okay? So what we really care about is not gross domestic product, but GDP per person. This gives us a measurement of our standard of living, how much goods and services on average we can consume, okay? So let's say that we look at the United States and we have a GDP of $15 trillion, okay? Oops. That's the US, and we'll use Japan. And we'll say, Japan, if I ask the Japanese government, what's your GDP? What would they tell me? Would they tell me X amount of dollars? No. What do they call money in Japan? Yen, okay? So they may tell me 600 billion yen, okay? Yen. Which citizen's better off? I don't know. What do I have to do in order to be able to compare? Yeah, I've got to convert yen into dollars or dollars into yen, okay? What if it's 100 yen per dollar? And typically that's what it is, okay? Over the course of time, it's been up or down anywhere from 85 to 125 yen to the dollar. But over the course of time, generally speaking, it has averaged out more or less to 100 yen per dollar. So what does that mean? That means that the GDP of Japan is 6 billion if I divide it by yen, okay? If I divide it by yen. But what happens, what do I have it, 600? Oops. What happens should the exchange rate, now the price of money is always set by the marketplace, not always, but almost always, okay? The forces of supply and demand relative to each other, okay? How much yen do we want to buy and how much dollars do we want to sell? What if the exchange rate goes to 150 yen equals the dollar? Now what happens to the GDP of Japan when we convert it to dollars? It goes down by a third, okay? I mean, that would be an extreme example. But the point is that when we make this conversion, what number we end up with depends upon current exchange rates, okay? Which may or may not reflect the true purchasing value of the money. So we're not done yet. What we want to find out is GDP per person. Okay? So we have to divide this by the population and divide that by the population. And let's say that we find out that on average, once we divide GDP by the population, the average American GDP per capita is 50,000, and the average GDP in Japan per person is the equivalent of 60,000 US dollars. Okay? Now can we say, yeah, it would be a lot. Now can we say that the average Japanese is better off than the average American in terms of standard of living, the amount of goods and services on average each person in the country can consume? Can we say that they're better off? No, we can't. The reason being is that Japan, generally speaking, is a much more expensive place to live than the United States. That what a Japanese person would have to spend, what they could buy for $60,000, it would only take an American $45,000. Okay? We have to adjust it for its purchasing power, what it can actually buy. For example, let's say if you divided up the GDP of India by the population of India, you would end up, I don't know, I'm just going to guess, with a GDP per capita of $5,000. Okay? per person on average earns $5,000 a year. Could you survive on $5,000 a year in the United States?
No.
Hell no. Could you survive on $5,000 a year in India? The equivalent in Indian rupees? You sure can. Because when you go out to lunch here, it's going to cost you 20 bucks. When you go out to lunch in Bombay, it's going to cost you $2. When you buy a pair of shoes here, it's going to cost you 80 bucks. When you buy a pair in Bombay, it's going to cost you 12. Okay? When you go out for anything or do anything or buy anything, the prices on average comparatively at the current exchange rates are much, much lower. By the way, do you know how much money on average the majority of the planet lives on per day? Okay? What is the average income of most people, of 2/3 of the people on the planet? Do you know? Yeah, it's $700 a year. Yes. The majority of people on this planet, possibly as much as 2 out of every 3, live on the equivalent of $2 a day. Okay, $2 a day. Could you live on $2 a day? Hell no. But you can in Zambia. Okay, you can in Afghanistan. You can in Burma. All right, but not here. So we have to adjust these values for what they can actually buy. And even though prior to adjusting for purchasing power, Japan appears to have a higher per capita income. Once we adjust it for purchasing power, we find that the United States actually has the highest per capita income in terms of what we can actually buy with our average annual incomes, okay? Actually, I'm not sure it's the United States. Could be Switzerland, okay? Or it could be Sweden, maybe, somewhere around there, but I think Switzerland might be Switzerland. Yeah. Yeah. I love Switzerland. It is so beautiful. Oh my God. Everything is in order too. It's so German, right? You know, everything is in order here. Yeah. The trains work like German trains. You could set your watches by them, boy. That train's supposed to be here at 7:02. At 7:02, it's there. Right? Not like here. Right? Not at all. All right. So let's see. Anything else, or is it time for our break? All right. So this is called purchasing power parity. Okay. These adjustments that we make, we have to go through a process. We have to convert the currency, the GDP of one country into the currency of another. And then we have to divide it by the population to get GDP per capita. But we're not done yet. The next step is to adjust that number for what it can actually buy, right? You earn $5,000 a year in India, you can actually buy with the same amount of goods and services that an American would spend $12,000 on a year. So the actual real adjusted purchasing power per capita, GDP, is $12,000, not $5,000, okay?